You sit inside a world where feelings used to be the currency, and sincerity used to mean something, or at least you were raised to believe that. But now, you walk through a landscape shaped by algorithms, digital desire, and market logic disguised as romance. You aren't naive. You can feel it every time you open an app, and your worth is measured in swipes, filters, and seconds of attention. You scroll the way Western consumers shop: quick, transactional, replaceable. The emotional labor you pour into connection mirrors the unpaid overtime at a corporate job where you try to impress supervisors who barely know your name. You're performing, optimizing, selling, and the truth is, that's exactly what this environment trains you to do. Dating has slipped from an organic human ritual into a marketplace with supply, demand, and scarcity dynamics. You no longer compete on character. You compete on visibility, on photogenic angles, on the illusion of effortlessness. The old rules of attraction have been upgraded into a tiered system of desirability economics. And you can tell because the people you approach aren't responding to you. They're responding to the entire market they believe they can access. You're one notification among hundreds, a number in a digital vending machine offering endless flavors. So you do what consumers always do when overwhelmed. You skim, you skip, you hesitate. Hyperchoice kills commitment, and abundance kills appreciation. You keep thinking you'll be noticed for your authenticity, but the system wasn't built to reward authenticity. It was built to reward engagement, to keep you scrolling, comparing, doubting yourself. The structure of dating apps mirrors the structure of social media addiction: intermittent validation, unpredictable rewards, escalating emotional investment. And in that system, your feelings aren't emotions, they're data signals. You're not choosing people. You're navigating incentives. The very architecture is designed to cultivate emotional inflation, where your efforts lose value simply because they're too available in a marketplace, drowning in options. This is the new emotional economy, a place where desire is measured by metrics, where your attention is harvested like a resource, where your loneliness becomes someone else's monetization strategy. Romantic illusions didn't die because people stopped caring. They died because the market became louder than the heart. You can sense it each time a spark fades before it even starts, each time someone ghosts, not because of you, but because they want to preserve their optionality. This is not personal, it's structural, but that doesn't make it hurt less. You weren't taught how to date in a world where everyone behaves like investors, evaluating risk, reward, and future return. You weren't prepared to understand that attraction now follows the logic of financial markets: high volatility, fast exits, emotional bubbles, and sudden crashes. You notice how people hold out for an imaginary, better deal, how they treat potential partners like items waiting for a discount. You see how intimacy competes with entertainment, how connection competes with convenience, and somewhere inside you, a quiet realization forms. Maybe you're not failing at romance. Maybe you're navigating a market disguised as a love story, one where sincerity is underpriced, expectations are inflated, and attention is the most valuable currency. Now forget whatever you're dealing with today. Let's walk through the truth together. You begin to notice a strange economic phenomenon unfolding in your romantic life. The more you give, the less it seems to matter. You keep offering affection, consistency, and emotional labor, the way a well-meaning business might over-deliver to attract loyal customers. But the response you get feels eerily similar to the inflation effect, the psychological law that whatever becomes too abundant loses its perceived value. You're not being unappreciated because you're unworthy. You're being unappreciated because you're offering something in a marketplace that rewards scarcity, mystery, and selective access. Think about how Western consumers behave in a grocery aisle, packed with endless choices. They skip the items they've seen too many times. They gravitate toward whatever feels limited, seasonal, or hard to get. The same pattern emerges in modern dating. People treat interest like a commodity, whose value goes up when it's withheld. And you, trying to be genuine, find yourself accidentally flooding the market with your effort. You think affection demonstrates commitment, but in an age where everyone is overloaded with digital attention, it often signals disposability instead. When everything is available, nothing feels special. This is where hypergamy enters the picture, not as a moral failing, but as a behavioral algorithm. People pursue what they believe they can access, not what they deeply need. When the market shows them 10, 50, or 100 supposedly better profiles, their expectations inflate like a financial bubble. Standards drift from realistic to delusional. You're no longer evaluated as an individual. You're evaluated as a possibility among infinite imagined upgrades. And this creates the gratitude paradox. The more options someone perceives, the less grateful they become for anything real. Gratitude shrinks in the presence of abundance. Appreciation requires constraints. But you're trapped in a psychological loop where you believe more giving will compensate for the lack of reciprocity. You try harder. You check in more often. You accommodate preferences, clear space in your schedule, communicate transparently. And every new act of generosity slowly becomes invisible because the baseline keeps rising. You're dealing with emotional inflation. Whatever you provide becomes the new normal, and whatever exceeds that gets absorbed into expectation. There is no celebration, no recognition, just quiet entitlement. Meanwhile, the person on the receiving end feels no urgency to reciprocate. Why would they? The market whispers that there's always someone else willing to give the same effort with fewer requests. So they drift into passive consumption, taking your emotional labor the same way they scroll through content. Mindlessly, without investment, without responsibility. This is where the emotional economy collapses. When the supply of attention feels infinite, the demand for commitment evaporates. And you, unaware of the invisible contracts forming beneath the surface, keep paying emotional costs that yield no return. You're essentially subsidizing someone's comfort while bankrupting your own self-worth. But the harsh truth is this: inflation doesn't stop because you're kind. Markets don't stabilize because you try harder. And dating doesn't become fair simply because you're sincere. You're participating in a structure where abundance is weaponized, where expectations inflate faster than feelings can keep up, and where the cheapest thing, ironically, becomes genuine care. So you stand there, offering something real in a world conditioned to prefer illusions. You're giving warmth to people who have been taught to chase novelty, and slowly, quietly, painfully, you begin to understand that your value isn't disappearing, it's being mispriced. Not because you're too much, but because the market you're in has forgotten how to recognize anything worth keeping. You begin to see the architecture beneath every interaction, the hidden scaffolding of invisible contracts. You never wrote them, you never signed them, yet you keep living by them as if they carry legal weight. You give attention, expecting appreciation. You offer consistency, expecting reciprocity. You show vulnerability, expecting emotional safety. But none of these expectations were ever stated. And in the modern dating market, anything left unspoken eventually becomes a liability. You feel it when you text first for the 5th time in a row, when you accommodate plans without being asked, when you're patient with someone who gives you fragments and calls it effort. You tell yourself you're being understanding, but what you're really doing is forming emotional contracts in your head. Contracts where your investment entitles you to care, clarity, or commitment. And because the other person never agreed, you end up resenting them for breaking rules they never knew existed. This is the reciprocity breakdown, the slow erosion of balance when one person begins to pay all the emotional costs while the other enjoys all the benefits. You think you're building a connection, but you're actually underwriting someone's comfort, paying premiums on a relationship that only exists in your imagination. The more you give, the more the imbalance grows. And the more the imbalance grows, the more you convince yourself that one more act of care will finally tip the scales. But that's not how markets work. And dating today is a market more than it is a meeting of hearts. The system trains people to behave like shoppers, evaluating products with lenient return policies. If a connection feels heavy, uncertain, or slightly inconvenient, they don't communicate. They exit. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just quietly, like returning an item without making eye contact with the cashier. That's the cruel softness of modern dating. People avoid confrontation not out of kindness, but out of indifference. And you end up reading silence like scripture, trying to decipher meanings that don't exist. Meanwhile, your self-worth begins to erode. Not in a dramatic moment of heartbreak, but slowly, through micro-rejections that accumulate like emotional dust. A late reply here, a cancellation there, a lack of enthusiasm disguised as busyness. None of it is fatal on its own, but psychologically, it creates a loop. If I just try harder, I'll earn what I haven't been given. That's learned helplessness, the belief that more effort is the solution, even when effort has never been the problem. You sink deeper into self-deception loops. You reinterpret minimal engagement as potential. You mistake politeness for interest. You rationalize inconsistency as anxiety. You convince yourself that staying patient is noble, when in reality, you're afraid to confront the truth. You want something they don't, and you keep hoping that your emotional labor will magically convert their indifference into desire. But invisible contracts work only one way, inward. They bind you, not them. They obligate you, not them. And each time expectations fail to align with reality, your emotional credit score drops a little more. You begin to doubt your worth, not because you've done something wrong, but because you've been paying interest on a connection that isn't accruing any value. Modern dating didn't create this imbalance, it simply amplified it. Algorithms made it easier. Hyperchoice normalized it. And silent exits made it painless for the person walking away, while excruciating for the one left negotiating imaginary terms. Eventually, you face the truth. In a world where everyone is taught to optimize, you've been taught to overgive. In a world obsessed with optionality, you've been taught to overinvest. And in a marketplace that rewards detachment, you've been operating with a heart still wired for reciprocity. You are not wrong for wanting connection, but you are exhausted from trying to build one on a foundation no one else agreed to stand on. You start to recognize the quiet but steady collapse of your own boundaries. Not because someone forced you to break them, but because the modern dating market taught you that boundaries are a luxury and desperation is the default. You bend, you adapt, you accommodate, all in the hope that someone will finally choose you. You tell yourself you're being flexible, open-minded, emotionally mature. But beneath that self-narrative lies something darker. The fear of being discarded in a system that treats people like replaceable subscriptions. Every time you overlook a red flag, you make a withdrawal from your own self-respect. Every time you wait hours for a reply you would have answered in minutes, you reinforce the belief that your needs are negotiable. Every time you excuse inconsistency, you remind yourself that your standards are optional, while theirs are absolute. This isn't kindness. This is boundary collapse, the slow melting of your identity into a mold you hope someone will approve of. And the market rewards your collapse with exactly nothing. Because in a world driven by incentive structures, people respond not to your generosity, but to your limits. Boundaries create value. The lack of them creates emotional clearance sales. And you've been discounting your worth while wondering why no one is paying full price. You convince yourself that if you become easier to love, someone will finally stay. But love has never been the issue. Optionality is. When a person believes they can access endless alternatives, your sacrifices don't register as devotion, they register as desperation. Western work culture mirrors this. The employee who works late every night isn't respected. They're taken for granted. The one who guards their time is seen as high value. This paradox follows you into romance. You keep giving because you want to earn what should have required compatibility, not performance. You give more when you receive less because you're stuck in a psychological sunk cost fallacy. You've invested so much of yourself that walking away feels like failure. So you add emotional labor like patchwork on a sinking ship, hoping effort will reverse the tide. But markets don't reward sunk costs, they punish them. The person you're chasing senses your collapse, not consciously, but behaviorally. Humans instinctively detect when someone is negotiating against themselves. It's the same instinct that makes people treat a too eager salesperson with suspicion, or take advantage of a colleague who never says no. In dating, boundary collapse signals one thing. You can give me everything, and I won't have to give much in return. And the tragic part is that you know this. Yet you keep going, because the illusion of potential feels safer than the emptiness of letting go. You cling to maybes the way an investor clings to a failing stock, not because it's performing, but because the pain of admitting loss feels unbearable. But your boundaries were never meant to be tools of negotiation. They were meant to be the architecture of your dignity. Without them, you drift into emotional contortion, shrinking, bending, reshaping yourself into whatever version feels most tolerable to the other person. You betray yourself in subtle increments, then wonder why the connection feels lopsided. Modern dating didn't teach you how to love. It taught you how to hustle for affection, how to audition for attention, how to tolerate emotional minimalism as if it were intimacy. And somewhere along the way, you forgot that the person you're supposed to protect first is you. You weren't abandoned by romance. You abandoned your boundaries. You didn't lose value. You gave people the blueprint for discounting it. And now you stand here, realizing that the harshest part of the dating market is not that others treat you as replaceable, but that you started to believe them. There comes a moment when the illusion you've been maintaining begins to show its cracks. Not because someone shattered it for you, but because your mind can no longer afford the psychological cost of holding it together. Romance used to feel like a story, organic, unpredictable, human. Now it feels like a marketplace powered by algorithms and cultivated fantasies. And you, caught in the middle, keep trying to force meaning into a system that treats emotions as transactions and compatibility as a filter setting. You start noticing how much of your longing is shaped not by genuine connection, but by the stories you tell yourself to avoid facing the truth. You imagine potential where there is only convenience. You project compatibility onto people who haven't demonstrated any. You interpret breadcrumbs as signals, silence as mystery, avoidance as emotional depth. But none of this is intimacy. It's self-preservation, a psychological strategy to protect yourself from admitting you're trapped in a loop of self-deception. Loss aversion takes over. You hold on to almost relationships with the same anxiety as someone clutching a stock that keeps dipping lower. You know it's failing. You know it's draining you. But the fear of losing what you've invested, even if it was built on nothing, feels more painful than the freedom waiting on the other side. So you stay. Not because the connection grows, but because the illusion is hard to abandon. This is the cost of illusion maintenance. You spend emotional energy propping up expectations that reality never agreed to fulfill. You rehearse imaginary futures. You negotiate imaginary changes. You justify imaginary potential. Meanwhile, the other person continues to do what the market incentivizes them to do: minimize effort, maximize validation, and avoid emotional risk. You hope for reciprocity in a system where commitment feels like a downgrade and detachment feels like a flex. You tell yourself it's temporary. You tell yourself you can wait it out. But illusions aren't sustained by patience. They're sustained by denial. And denial is expensive. It costs you time, dignity, mental clarity, and the capacity to see yourself as someone worthy of a real, mutual connection, not just the shadow of one. The dating marketplace thrives on this denial. It keeps people chasing what doesn't want them, longing for what isn't available, tolerating what isn't enough. Emotional labor flows upward toward the least invested partner. Desire concentrates around the least responsive. Effort is redirected toward those who treat it as disposable. This isn't a judgment. It's an observation of how social incentive structures shape behavior. When scarcity creates desire and abundance dilutes it, people naturally gravitate toward whatever feels just out of reach. But you are not meant to live suspended in pursuit of something that never materializes. You are not meant to bleed self-worth into a connection that cannot hold it. You are not meant to shrink so someone else feels taller, nor bend so someone else feels free. And yet, you find yourself doing exactly that because illusions are comforting even when they hurt. They give you a sense of direction, even if they lead nowhere. They give you a sense of purpose, even if it's the wrong one. They give you a sense of connection, even if it's only with a fantasy. Eventually, the truth becomes unavoidable. The dating marketplace didn't become brutal overnight. You just became aware of the emotional math behind it. Hyperchoice inflates expectations. Algorithms reward passivity. Abundance devalues sincerity. And you, trying to navigate it all with an open heart, end up paying the psychological bill. But here's the harshest realization, and the most liberating one. The illusion dies the moment you stop financing it. The moment you withdraw your emotional credit from a system that never offered a return. The moment you stop mistaking effort for partnership, hope for progress, and desire for compatibility. You don't escape the modern dating market by trying harder. You escape by refusing to invest in something that has already shown you its valuation of you. And when you finally stop paying the cost of the illusion, you reclaim the one thing this system cannot algorithmically manipulate: your autonomy. You sit there now with a quieter mind than when you started. Not because anything became easier, but because the fog has thinned. Modern dating isn't broken. It's simply honest in ways people aren't ready to admit. It reveals incentives, exposes illusions, magnifies insecurity, and forces you to confront what you've been avoiding. Your worth can't depend on anyone's fluctuating attention, not in a world built on distraction. So you breathe, slowly. You reclaim your boundaries. You reclaim the parts of yourself you kept discounting. You realize that autonomy feels unfamiliar only because you've spent so long outsourcing it. But you're here now, grounded, awake, aware. And that awareness is worth more than any illusion you ever chased. You don't need to outperform a market. You don't need to negotiate your value. You don't need to collapse yourself to fit someone else's preferences. You only need to choose yourself with the same devotion you've given to people who never learned how to receive it. Sleep with that truth. Let it settle. Let it strengthen you in quiet ways.